Welcome to Editor in Grief, a podcast about the news business hosted by John Biggs and Jim Rich. With a combined 60 years of experience in newspapers, TV, and online, we bring sanity to an insane industry. Wondering how to manage misinformation, how to stay informed, how artists and writers will survive AI, and how the news cycle sausage is made? This is the podcast for you. This is Editor in Grief. Welcome back to Editor in Grief. This is a podcast about the media by two longtime media heads. I'm John Biggs.
I'm Jim Rich.
And our goal is to talk about what everybody thinks is happening in the media and what's actually really happening in the media using our deep skills, experience, and or our crankiness. So welcome, Jim. I'm glad we got to do this today.
Great. It's great to be back. And I think you got the order wrong there. You probably, should have been leading with the crankiness, but that's okay. That's all right.
Look, we can't all be, every podcast can't just be just us like complaining about stuff because that's, yeah, you're right. Well, no, I also have another podcast about psychedelics. So that's nicer. That's like happy.
Yes.
And happy. And this is just us like complaining about stuff. All right. Perfect.
We could certainly combine the two one day.
All right. So let's talk about this. So recently, with the recent, there's something happened on Monday that was really exciting for all of us. This being Thursday, Trump came into power. He sat down in front of reporters and he went through his little executive order list, which was a lot of fun for everybody. Now, the interesting thing I saw on that day was that when Biden did this, he basically didn't let anybody in. He did it for like 2 minutes and kicked everybody out. A journalist, a Washington Post political reporter, said this. Why are political reporters such crybabies, and why are journalists in general such crybabies? And what is this? What's the whole idea of access journalism? Why don't we talk about access journalism? I'll let you define it since you guys probably had a lot more. Did we have a lot of access journalism? I guess we did. Anyway, keep going.
Well, it's interesting because it was that is a phrase that has been used as rightfully so as a pejorative toward what we traditionally viewed as print journalists. I do think that it seeped into the quote unquote digital sphere of the business as well, and probably more so than those who pride themselves on being digital journalists would actually like to admit. As far as defining it, I think it comes down to human nature and people wanting to take the easy way out in whatever it is they're doing. And so journalists are not immune from that situation whatsoever. So you see it a lot in political reporting. I also saw it a lot in sports reporting, oddly enough, which has significantly less impact on society. But there's a couple of things happening. There's this herd mentality where in both of those settings, you are in groups, right? Because you have your bureau, you have your politics bureau, whether it's the, DC bureau or whether it's your local municipality, here in New York City, et cetera. And the same thing happens with beat writers in the sports world. They're all covering the Yankees. They're all there every day in front of the same people asking the same questions.
Yeah, they literally used to follow the teams around, right? And this is the same thing.
Yeah, they still do to a lesser degree, and fewer of them do. But yes, and similar in a similar way that
politicals
do the same thing. So a couple of things happen. You have the basic human instinct and emotion to not sort of stand out, right? You don't want to break away from the crowd because I've seen it. The crowd when political journalists or sports journalists ask questions that are tough and might actually elicit a really difficult response, you see a lot of the other journalists sort of having negative reactions to that. And I think a little bit of that is, well, you're showing us up kind of thing. It's like stick with the group here and don't anybody rock the boat. And we'll all just, be able to have martinis afterwards and everything will be great. And then the other thing that happens, and these are intertwined, is there's this fear of, quote, burning sources. And I put quotes around burning because any source worth anything is one worth taking the chance losing, because you'll find another one. But if the source is truly good, they understand your job and they understand how you have to do it. And sometimes it's asking and writing about things that might make either you as the source or people who you're trying to protect as the source uncomfortable. So anyway, this is something that's been going on for the history of journalism. And a manifestation of it is you will see sometimes the journalists, without understanding how they are exposing themselves, will say the quiet part out loud, which is what we're talking about here, which is, the complaints about how, well, the president didn't talk to us enough or didn't talk to me enough. And if a reporter had said that to me as their editor, I would have said, well, find somebody else who will talk to you about this, right? And let's get the information that they're not giving you, because there are other ways around it. So it's annoying. It's detrimental to what the mission of sound journalism actually is. But it only gets worse. I mean, and I have a theory. I think that I have no real tangible way of proving this, but as the pool of journalists continues to dwindle, I think you'll find that these quote unquote access journalists are the ones who find a way to survive.
So I want to unpack a few things, because I think this is important for just the lay listener to understand. Because what you said was this idea that, and I want to go back to the idea that the pool journalists, or these people, the milquetoast journalists, as it were, who've risen to their height of power, in that they can go to the White House every day, right? So not everybody gets to do that. A certain group of these people. Now, one thing you said was that this group of people are not going to say things that are going to upset the rest of the pool journalists. So they're not going to show off per se. So what you get are questions that are kind of milquetoast. And when you get a question that isn't milquetoast, it kind of upsets the whole thing, because even like the president's PR person, the Spicer, whoever it's going to be this year, or this week, gets upset because you're asking difficult questions that they can't particularly answer. So you have the PR person come in, and this could be in sports, this could be in presidential area. They come in, they know a certain amount of stuff. They have one thing to say. Today, blardy blar, we lit a tree with the Christmas tree. And then somebody gets up and says, well, what about, I don't know, Gaza? And that upsets everybody in the room, because it's not supposed to be about Gaza. Then all of a sudden we have to write a new story about it.
Yes.
And it discourages that person from ever asking those hard questions.
Well, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but the other thing that happens at the same time, and this is more important, and this to me is where, as journalists, we start losing the plot a little bit, is it initially upsets the flack, the PR person, mm-hmm. or the politician or the athlete that you're questioning. It upsets them. And then that makes them a little bit edgier, a little crankier, a little shorter, a little more terse in their response or their reception to follow-up questions on other topics from everyone else in the scrum. And that's what everyone else in the scrum gets upset about. Mm-hmm. So there's like, oh, look, now I can't get the answers to the questions I need because you screwed it up by asking that other question that none of us were going to ask, right? Which probably was a question worth asking, by the way. But so that's that's where the really selfish, sort of self-centered human aspect of this comes in.
And this is where a lot of the interview problems come from. This is where a lot of the media comes from, in that everybody's saying, oh, it's everything, there's fake news and all this other BS. And it's just like, no, it's not fake news. You get spoon-fed a piece of information because you have access to it. And you can either take that information and run with it, or you can start asking questions. You can do different things. But the one thing you can't do is double down on the information as it's being given, or nor can you kind of like expand on it, or you can expand out of the topic because you're in a situation where talking about game 5 or whatever, you can't talk about game 2 or you'll piss off the PR person. So I think there's a frustration there from the reader who wants the answer is, what are we going to do about Gaza? When the only answer that they're ever going to get out of this person, especially under a Trump administration, is we lit the tree today, or we're going to put Easter eggs out tomorrow, and that's how this is going to look.
Yeah, and think about it from the perspective of the quote unquote access journalists that we're portraying here, which is their ability to do their job almost solely relies on the access that they're given, whether it's being allowed into the White House press room, for those scrum sessions with the president's press secretary, and we saw it in the first Trump administration. He attempted to ban them from that, right? To kick them out of those sessions. So imagine if you're one of those journalists who that's the only way you get anything that you can write about, and suddenly that's lost. That becomes the most valuable piece of currency that you have as a journalist, which is terrible for journalism and for the reader, which is what, when I talk about journalism, it's synonymous with the reader as far as I'm concerned. But that's a real thing. And so it's like, suddenly if you get kicked out of that, what are you possibly going to do? What are you going to tell your editor? Like, you're in a really big spot. And so the fact that publications have people in positions who think this way and whose abilities are limited this way is really, really, really at the heart of the problem. Like, we can sit here and pick on individual journalists all we want, but they're only able to do what they're allowed to do, and what their paychecks still continue to clear,
I mean, there's a number of, like, if we talk about niche things, like watches, for example. I cover watches. I've covered watches for years. But the journalists who cover watches aren't really journalists anymore. They're basically shills who work for the PR people, essentially, because first off, you're trying to sell ads on your website. And this is one thing that digital media actually did to journalism. It made the reporter and editor into an ad salesperson, whereas before, that wall should have been up. Has to be up. But for example, for this our thing, which is not journalistic per se, I have to be in charge of, like, maybe trying to make some money off this thing so we can feed our cats or something like that. But it's really, really difficult. And then going into that, worrying about, first off, you're going to piss off the flack. Second off, you're not going to get the story that you want anyway. So why even try is a big deal too. What you were talking about, the best of access journalists who basically got, who are now going to survive this journalism winter. Why do you think that's happening?
Well, again, I don't know. I have nothing tangible. This is just my gut, is that the folks who are more inclined to not rock the boat under good circumstances, when times are good, are certainly going to be even more inclined to not rock the boat as things get bad. And because of the dynamic you just described from an economic standpoint, what these publications are facing, the incentive is the number of employees that you end up have left over from whatever round of layoffs you're doing or reductions. You don't want them causing problems. You don't want them doing things, writing things, investigating things that are going to possibly upset potential advertisers, or at this point, readers, which I think is completely foolhardy. I mean, we see this now. CNN announcing today that they're laying off another 200 journalists, which again, an overall percentage.
200 TV journalists, and then they're going to hire 200 digital journalists, which is
so they say.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
Again, what that means at the end of the day, who knows? But more concerning to me is the fact that they're doing this in the name of, they say they're doing it in the name of coming into like the 21st century, becoming more digital, the whole digital first stuff, which is what the newspapers went through 10 to 15 years ago. It's ridiculous that a TV station in 2025 is having this come to Jesus moment. But to me, it's all BS anyway. And I think to a lot of people, because they're doing it, they're trying to tamp down the sort of news that will upset the incoming administration and its voters, trying to be everyone to everything to everybody.
And that's so the impetus to be everything to everybody is, I mean, it's clear because it has to. They're not going to survive otherwise. Is there any?
I don't think they're going to. I don't think that that's going to help them survive either. But they think it will.
Is there any point? Is there any point to create new journalism right now, or even create new journalists?
Well, the creating new journalists that's an episode unto itself. I think, taking a look at what the last 2 decades of J School has wrought onto the industry in conjunction with the decline of the industry. So those things happening simultaneously have fed off of one another, and I think in a negative manner. But so put that aside for a second. I talk to people all the time. They're like, well, you should, somebody should start an alternative site, a site that does exactly the things that we're talking about, right? And not the access nonsense, and not the, not trying to offend anybody. And yeah, that's great. And if this were 15 years ago, 10 years ago, it may have been a viable thing, and it still could be to a degree. But let's take a look at the sites that have, and the publications that have sprung up over the past 5-6 years. I mean, with rare exception, I don't see them having much success with the model that you and I are talking about.
Yeah, almost every single one of those big ones. You had friends who went over to those big ones. I forget their names now, but the one site that was hiring like everybody and their dog, and then went out of business like 6 months later.
Right, but again, that model was based off of something that was antiquated and a version of, well, let's just be straight down the middle, whatever that means. By the way, straight down when you talk about people saying, well, we want our coverage to be completely neutral and straight down the middle. Well, the truth doesn't exist in the middle. The truth exists usually in shades of gray on either side. And if you have solid reporting and contextual reporting, then you let the chips fall where they may, and you have confidence in that. I mean, we see that lack of confidence, the erosion of that confidence, the total lack of understanding of that dynamic in situations like with the LA Times and the Washington Post, with the during the election, when they were trying to clamp down on editorials and the types of coverage and the texture of the coverage. And this is just out of fear.
Well, does a newspaper need to have, or a website, does it need to have an op-ed page? Why does it need to have an op-ed page? I was thinking about that hard. I thought, like, okay, yeah, they if you hadn't heard, they essentially Washington Post, LA Times, they didn't run endorsements of Kamala Harris or whoever, Kamala. They didn't run endorsements of anybody, as far as I recall.
On the national level, on the local level, they still did.
Do we need a national endorsement from the Washington Post? First off, who cares? I mean, it's the Washington Post. It's not like I'm going to read this and say, oh well, now I'm convinced. Thanks to all these grumpy old scribblers in DC. Now I know who to vote for. It's not going to happen. It doesn't happen anymore. So does it matter? I mean, it's a lot of the things that we're complaining about are associated with the norms and systems that were put in place by our elders, which is saying a lot, to manage distance, right? The embargo was designed to manage distance. I have to send 15 letters to 15 major newspapers. It gets to LA first, and I don't want them to publish it until everybody else gets a chance. That's why we had embargoes. The press person, the PR person. The PR person existed because the CEO didn't want to do that job. Plus, the press person could actually manage it better because they're a little more divorced from the day-to-day hustle and bustle, and they can actually communicate better. And that idea of endorsements, if we were in, I don't know, Oshkosh, sitting getting the morning paper and the afternoon paper, absolutely, yeah, maybe an endorsement would be interesting because I'd hear from Old Man Stevens at the morning paper and Old Man Jenkins at the evening paper, and I'd get two different ideas, especially if I didn't have a marketplace of ideas at my fingertips, and the only person I talked to was my cow. So we're in a situation where we're using tools that don't need to be there anymore.
I would agree with you
Mic drop.
At one on one level here. And so when you say, does it matter? Framed in the context of the antiquated model that you're describing, I agree. I say, no, it does not technically matter. Where it matters or starts mattering is, and I think this is really the key aspect of both of the situations at the LA Times and the Washington Post, is it would be totally fine if either of those owners truly believed that what you just said, right? And that no matter who the editorial board was going to endorse, we don't need endorsements anymore because they've outlived, their usefulness. But that's not what was happening. So get rid of the editorial boards at all newspapers. Fine. Okay. Let's do that. Let's wave the magic wand and let's say that's happened. The sentiment behind the owners of the LA Times and the Washington Post is not going to change, though. Their attempts to soften or dull or manipulate coverage of certain political parties or politicians would still be there. And I think it would manifest itself in different ways. Because that's really at the heart of this. Jeff Bezos was not trying to be a champion for a new age of journalism. He's not really doing this in the interest of the reader. He just wasn't. I mean, so he has that to fall back on. I mean, you eloquently articulate the sort of the current state of editorial boards and what they're used for at all anymore. But that's convenient for him, and it's convenient for the owners of the LA Times. It as very often is the case nowadays, it obfuscates the issue as opposed to clarifies it.
Now, I know the answer to this, and I think you know the answer to this too, but I'm going to ask it. Like, would the ideal news organization, and everybody says everything's fake, everything's false. We say Fox News is false. They say New York Times is false, MSNBC, all this other BS. Can you create a absolutely true news organization? Has it been tried? Have you seen it?
It's being attempted in a lot of places. It's just a matter of whether the execution is solid or not. I think that places like the New York Times honestly believe that they are doing that, and that they're trying to do that. Again, we pick on the New York Times because they're the largest and the most obvious. We could sit here and we'd take days to dissect, where they're failing. Every publication will fail at some point when it comes to the attempts.
We could argue that every publication fails constantly to a degree that's like, out of the gate, it's going to start to fail.
Yeah, but sure, but framing it that way gives the impression that it's a hopeless endeavor or a useless endeavor, and that we no longer need journalism. And I know that's not what you're saying, but
yeah, I'm just trying to figure out I'll let you finish, but I think the where I'm getting at is that there should be a way that and there will be a way that I can consume a happenstance, something that happened, Hindenburg explosion or something like that. Give me some video, give me some interviews, give me some people, and I should be able to produce a piece of truth associated with that. That's not going to like bring in any bias, all this other stuff. And I think it's entirely feasible, and it's going to get even easier, especially with the AI. We could take a picture of a car crash and say, this person got hit, this person got hit. Now, the question is that news? Is that interesting? Will anybody read that? I don't think so. That's the other trick. I think people love to have just a soupçon of BS in every news story just to get them riled up.
Well, I don't even know if they need. I will disagree. That may be true, but I'm going to disagree with the sort of inherent aspect of that, or the implied inherent aspect of that, which is, I think what you're misidentifying as that little bit of BS that people want in their news is they want something that's going to be compelling. And so not all stories start with the same level of, being compelling. They just don't. And this is a thing that we used to get criticized a lot for, in the tabloid world, was We had shorter spaces, which is a thing that doesn't exist today in the digital sphere, whether it be for headlines or for the actual story lengths. And so you had to get to the point quickly. You had to tell people immediately why this was compelling and why this is going to be of interest to them. And I used to, again, the motto I used all the time was, whether it's for a headline or a longer story, is that you can make people upset. You can make people happy. You can make people furious. You can make them curious. You can inspire them. You can make them sad, but you can never, ever, ever make them bored. And so that's it. Now you can hear it. You could take that motto and you could manipulate it and you could twist it and you could turn it into BS. That could be an excuse for a lot of BS. But those who are truly talented as journalists are able to execute on that. And those are the ones who create the most compelling and interesting stories to read or videos to watch, et cetera, or podcasts to listen to, et cetera, et cetera.
I think.
But by the way, that two things that costs money, and it threatens to piss a lot of people off, which then could cost more money or it could hurt the amount of money that you're being.
Well, it even pisses off other journalists, because you have one journalist who's like,
yes,
I don't know, who's able to write a compelling story about a cat got in a tree, and I'm a schlub who's AP styling my way through just, I don't know, school board meetings and stuff, and I can't get there.
Well, but hold on, but see now, okay, so this is also important. Is when I say they have the skill of being able to make it compelling, yes, a good writer is going to go a long way towards accomplishing that. But some of the best reporters I ever worked with were the worst writers I've ever met, which is why everybody needs a good editor. So I don't say that as an insult. I say that the reporting skills, though, that thing that they had in their gut, which was, oh yeah, the cat stuck up in the tree, but wait, there's more to this. So let me talk to, the owner. Let me talk to the cop or the fireman who rescued it. Let me talk to the little girl who was there witnessing it all, and et cetera, et cetera. So it's finding these little morsels of humanity that sort of complement the bare bone facts that makes something compelling and makes a story compelling. And that's what journalism is. I mean, it sounds completely simplistic and like I'm stating the obvious, but this gets lost along the way sometimes.
I think this might be a good point to close on this specific concept. Yeah. I mean, I think what I was proposing, again, I've been thinking a lot about this, the idea that everything's fake, everything's false. You talk to anybody on the street, anybody who is not a journalist, who doesn't create this for a living, everything is fake. The coverage is fake. If you look at most coverage, it's pretty even-handed. There's not really, and plus most coverage isn't even that important. So if we're talking about like wildfires or whatever, what they mean by it being fake is that it doesn't match their own conspiracy theory mind of how things went down, whereas the average journalist, and if what they really want is exactly what I described, they want, in their own minds, they want a camera that takes video and then produces a news story based on that video without being touched by human hands. They want a McDonald's hamburger versus mom's meatloaf. And I think they will find fairly quickly, and I'm sure there's 100 startups right now trying to build this, they'll find very quickly that news is even worse than the quote unquote fake news, because it doesn't tell anything. It doesn't have any humanity to it. No anima. So,
well, yeah, and I would just add a couple things to that real quick. One, so the whole movement a few years back of citizen journalism is going to replace, professional journalism. Gets to the heart of what you're talking about, which is folks who are unhappy with the current state of journalism or media think, well, if I'm the gatekeeper, then therefore this will be.
They don't see it as gatekeeper, right? They see
it
as.
No, but the gatekeeper is just the person who's there witnessing the news, firsthand, and then reporting it back. I mean, that's it, right? That's the structure. And so inherently there will always be a gatekeeper, because there's going to be somebody there who's the witness, who's bearing witness to whatever the news event is, whether it be 9/11 or Trump administration, rounding up immigrants and sending them back to whatever country they are in. Like, somebody has to witness it and then report it. And in that process, you are imposing your own perceptions as a human being. Now, the last thing I'm going to mention, because I mentioned it to you earlier before we got on here, and it just drives me insane, but it ties into all of this. I was on LinkedIn earlier, and I saw an ad for an, quote, accountability journalist. And I just thought, holy crap, this is like, we have now reached full-scale redundancy. That's used to be what journalism, that was baked into, the phrase journalist or reporter. And now we are, as an industry, have decided, well, some of us are actually going to do the job, which is, we're going to call those accountability reporters, and the rest. What does that make a reporter who's not an accountability reporter then? A PR flack,
a PR flack, or a fiction
stenographer.
Writer. A stenographer. That could be it too.
So, I mean, look,
it's not writing, it's typing.
I've had the same conversations with friends and associates who are not in the industry, who have a total misunderstanding of what the industry is. And like, we can't go around and talk to every individual in this country who has that misunderstanding, no matter how they got it. That's the job of the government. And when I say that, I don't mean the government's be like, you should only listen to NPR and read the New York Times because they're liberal and we're liberal and blah, blah, blah. Now, my point is, the government is supposed to be there to regulate. They're supposed to regulate against platforms and publications that intentionally spread misinformation or libel or et cetera. That's what libel laws were for. I know they've been totally thrown, out the window when it comes to digital platforms, et cetera, et cetera. But the idea that journalists or the remaining journalists are the ones responsible for correcting that and saying, oh, we have to go on a campaign to convince people that we are real and the other people are not. Well, that's insane. And that will never, ever, ever happen.
All the quote unquote power has been stripped from the average journalist. They've been stripped from the organizations, and it's also been stripped from the government, right? So you're talking about regulation. They used to regulate it because it was a finite resource. It was similar to oil. You got to regulate oil so somebody's not, like, I don't know, drilling in the middle of your backyard that you don't want it to happen. Now it's not a finite resource. We talked about this last week.
But you're sounding like a member of Congress just using that as an excuse. I mean, yeah. You're not wrong, and I'm busting your chops a little bit here, mm-hmm. but okay, so that's the reality. But that doesn't mean our government should just throw up its hands and go, oh well, let you guys just figure it out, I guess, and we'll see who's left standing, because we know who's going to be left standing. Because what's the old expression? A lie travels 8 million times the speed of a truth.
Right. Yeah, exactly. All right. Well, let's bring this back up when we convene again. Hopefully, this is helpful to folks to understand how this freaking sausage is made. At this point, my tummy's hurts from just thinking about it.
Too much sausage will do that.
Too much sausage. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think we need I'm going to put a kitten at the end of this episode just to like make myself happy. I'm going to like have like a gambling kitten.
Just make sure it's not a dead kitten.
This is Editor in Grief, a podcast about media by two of the most grievous humans you'll ever meet. I'm John Biggs.
I'm Jim Rich.
We'll see you next episode.
Later.